The apartment David Bowie and Iggy Pop shared in West Berlin's Schöneberg neighborhood had 7 rooms, but they spent most of their time in the kitchen, cooking simple meals and trying to remember how to be human again. Both men had nearly died from their respective addictions, Bowie from cocaine, Iggy from heroin, and Berlin was supposed to be their rehabilitation, their chance to start over in a city where nobody knew or cared who they were. But recovery proved more difficult and painful than either had anticipated. The days were structured and almost monastic. Wake early, eat breakfast, bicycle through the city, visit museums, read books, go to sleep at reasonable hours. But the nights were different. Berlin in the late 70s had a legendary underground scene. Clubs like So 36, where artists, musicians, and misfits gathered to dance to electronic music and forget their problems. Bowie and Iggy would drink beer and lose themselves in the crowd, finding temporary relief from the depression and anxiety that sobriety brought. And in the spaces between day and night, between discipline and release, Bowie began writing songs that documented this strange liminal existence, creating albums that were simultaneously about recovery and about the realization that recovery might mean living with permanent damage, permanent coldness, permanent disconnection from the warmth and emotion that normal people seem to access so easily. If you want to discover how David Bowie's darkest period created his greatest artistic achievement, subscribe to our channel now, because the Berlin Trilogy saved his life while nearly destroying his soul. By May 1976, David Bowie knew that if he stayed in Los Angeles any longer, he would die there. The Victoria Station scandal had made remaining in Britain impossible, and LA had become a chemical prison where cocaine was everywhere and escape seemed impossible. His weight had dropped to 95 pounds. His paranoia had reached levels where he believed supernatural forces were hunting him through mirrors. His memory was so damaged by constant drug use that he could no longer reliably remember what had happened yesterday versus what had happened last week. The decision to move to Berlin was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it was a city where he could afford to live quietly, where the music industry presence was minimal, where he could disappear into anonymity. Symbolically, it was a divided city, literally split by a concrete wall, and Bowie felt divided himself, torn between David Jones the person and David Bowie the persona, between the desire to live and the exhaustion that made death seem appealing, between sobriety and the chemical comfort of addiction. He moved to Berlin in late 1976, initially staying in hotels before finding the apartment in Schöneberg. The choice of neighborhood was deliberate. It was working class, unglamorous, far from the artistic and diplomatic quarters where celebrities might be recognized. His new routine was designed to be the opposite of his LA lifestyle. Instead of staying awake for days on cocaine, he would sleep normal hours. Instead of subsisting on milk and peppers, he would eat proper meals. Instead of conducting occult rituals alone in his mansion, he would force himself to interact with the world through museums, galleries, and cultural activities. But this transformation wasn't smooth or easy. Withdrawal from cocaine produced depression so severe that Bowie would sometimes spend entire days in bed, unable to find a reason to get up. The absence of the drug's artificial energy left him feeling hollow and purposeless. And Berlin itself, with its gray skies and cold weather, and the ever-present wall dividing east from west, reinforced rather than alleviated his sense of isolation and division. When Iggy Pop joined Bowie in Berlin in early 1977, it was supposed to help both of them. Iggy was in even worse shape than Bowie. His heroin addiction had destroyed his career with the Stooges, left him penniless and homeless, and brought him to the edge of death multiple times. Bowie invited him to Berlin partly out of genuine friendship and concern, but also because he knew that having someone else to take care of would give him a sense of purpose and responsibility that might help keep him sober. They moved into the 7-room apartment together, and what followed was one of the strangest living arrangements in rock history. Two of the world's most notorious rock stars, both recovering from catastrophic addictions, living like college roommates in a modest Berlin apartment, cooking breakfast together, doing dishes, riding bicycles through the city like ordinary citizens. The media would have been fascinated if they had known, but that was precisely why Bowie had chosen Berlin. It was a city where privacy was still possible, where two gaunt men speaking English with strange accents could blend into the background of a population that had its own traumas to process. The dynamic between them was complicated and sometimes volatile. Both were dealing with depression, withdrawal symptoms, and the existential crisis that comes with sobriety after years of chemical escape. Iggy had episodes of suicidal ideation, standing on the apartment balcony and contemplating jumping, while Bowie talked him down with a combination of reason and shared desperation. Bowie had his own dark moments, waking up crying from nightmares about the Los Angeles period, spending mornings unable to shake the feeling that life without drugs wasn't worth living. They supported each other, but also triggered each other, their proximity meaning that when one descended into darkness, the other often followed. The apartment became a kind of emotional laboratory where they experimented with different strategies for surviving sobriety: exercise, culture, routine, creative work, occasional controlled nights out in clubs where they could drink beer but would hold each other accountable against harder substances. In late 1976 and early 1977, before moving to Berlin full-time, Bowie began recording what would become the Low album. The sessions took place at Château d'Hérouville in France, a studio located in a castle outside Paris. Producer Tony Visconti was shocked when he saw Bowie for the first time since the cocaine years, physically healthier, but emotionally flat, moving and speaking with a kind of robotic detachment that was unsettling. Bowie explained his vision for the album. He wanted to strip away melody, conventional song structure, romantic lyrics, everything that made pop music palatable and comforting. He wanted to create music that sounded the way depression felt: cold, fragmented, emotionally distant, occasionally punctuated by moments of mechanical energy that felt more like panic than joy. The title Low referred both to his emotional state and to his profile. He wanted to stay low, avoid attention, create art for its own sake, rather than for commercial success or public approval. The album that emerged was unlike anything Bowie or anyone else had created in mainstream rock. The first side consisted of short, fragmented songs that rarely exceeded 3 minutes and felt incomplete, as if Bowie didn't have the energy or emotional resources to sustain longer compositions. The second side was even more radical, entirely instrumental pieces, with titles referencing Eastern European cities, ambient soundscapes that evoked desolation and isolation. The track Warsaw, nearly 6 minutes of synthesizer drones and wordless vocals, sounded like a transmission from a cold, empty place where human warmth had been replaced by mechanical process. When RCA Records heard the finished album, they were horrified and tried to prevent its release, fearing it would destroy Bowie's commercial viability. But Bowie insisted, and Low was released in January 1977 to mixed reviews and surprising commercial success, reaching number 2 on the UK charts. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some called it genius. Others called it self-indulgent. None seemed to understand that it was neither, that it was simply accurate, a precise sonic representation of what post-addiction depression actually felt like. The creative partnership with Brian Eno, which would define the Berlin Trilogy's sound, began during the Low sessions and deepened throughout Heroes and Lodger. Eno brought to the collaboration an interest in ambient music, in texture and atmosphere over melody and traditional song structure, and a willingness to experiment with unconventional recording techniques. More importantly, he brought a philosophical approach that complemented Bowie's emotional state. Where Bowie was struggling with depression and the difficulty of feeling anything, Eno offered a framework that reframed this emotional flatness as a creative opportunity rather than a limitation. They could create music that didn't pretend to feel emotions. It didn't actually feel. That was honest about coldness and distance and the difficulty of connection. The synthesizers and electronic treatments that characterized the trilogy's sound weren't chosen for novelty or fashion. They were chosen because they matched the emotional temperature of what Bowie was experiencing. Because machines don't fake warmth they don't possess. Their working method involved extensive improvisation and chance operations, deliberately avoiding the kind of calculated craftsmanship that characterized commercial pop production. They would set up synthesizers and allow them to generate patterns, would record instrumental pieces without predetermined structures, would make decisions based on intuition and accident rather than commercial calculation. This approach sometimes frustrated the other musicians involved, who were used to more traditional recording processes, but it created a sonic palette that was genuinely innovative. The ambient pieces on Lowe's second side, the synthesizer textures throughout Heroes, the experimental approaches to rhythm and melody that characterized Lodger, all of this emerged from a creative partnership between two men who were, for different reasons, interested in making music that acknowledged distance, coldness, and the difficulty of authentic emotional expression in a world that demanded constant performance of feeling. When recording moved to Berlin for the Heroes album in mid-1977, Bowie chose Hansa Studios specifically because of its location next to the Berlin Wall. The studio occupied the upper floors of a building on Köthener Strasse, and from the recording room windows, you could see directly into East Berlin, could watch the guards in their watchtowers, could observe the death strip with its mines and barriers designed to kill anyone attempting to escape. This wasn't just atmospheric backdrop, it was deliberate creative strategy. Bowie wanted the physical presence of division and surveillance to influence the music, wanted the weight of Cold War tension to seep into the recordings. During breaks, musicians would look out at the wall and feel the psychological pressure of being watched, of being in a city where freedom was literally measured by which side of a concrete barrier you happened to be born on. The title track, Heroes, which would become the album's most famous song, and eventually one of Bowie's signature pieces, was directly inspired by a scene Visconti witnessed from the studio window. He saw two lovers meeting by the wall, kissing in the shadow of the guards and barriers, finding a moment of human connection in a landscape designed to prevent exactly that kind of intimacy. Bowie transformed this observation into a song about transcendence through love. But a specific kind of love. Not the romantic ideal, but rather the desperate, clinging to another person when you're both drowning. The way connection can feel heroic when the world is designed to keep everyone separate and isolated. The song's famous three-part structure, quiet verse, building bridge, explosive chorus, reflected this progression from isolation to desperate connection to transcendent release. And the way Bowie sang the word heroes with that distinctive pronunciation that made it sound both triumphant and ironic captured the ambiguity of the entire Berlin period. Were they heroes for surviving, or was heroism just another word for the bare minimum of continuing to live? Life in the Schöneberg apartment developed a rhythm that both men needed, even when they chafed against it. Mornings began around 7 with breakfast, usually simple fare like bread, cheese, eggs prepared in the shared kitchen, where they had spent so much time learning to be domestic again. After breakfast came the bicycle rides, weather permitting. They would pedal through Berlin's streets, two thin men on unremarkable bicycles, heads down against the cold wind, seeking the kind of exhaustion that might quiet the mind's constant noise. The routes varied, but often included museums. The Brücke Museum became a favorite, with its collection of German expressionist art that resonated with their own sense of distortion and alienation. They studied paintings that depicted psychological states rather than physical reality, found in these works a validation of their own struggle to represent inner experience through external form. Afternoons were for work. Bowie would spend hours at Hansa Studios, recording the albums that would become the trilogy, while Iggy worked on his own material with Bowie producing. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. Bowie's work on Iggy's albums The Idiot and Lust for Life gave him a creative outlet that was less personally intense than his own material, while Iggy got the benefit of Bowie's production expertise and the structure of having a project to focus on. But the work also revealed the ongoing fragility of both men's mental states. Recording sessions were sometimes interrupted by emotional crashes, moments when one or both would be overwhelmed by depression or anxiety and need to stop, step away, sometimes just sit in silence until the wave passed. The music they created during these periods carried the marks of this fragility: abrupt transitions, unfinished thoughts, moments where the structure seemed to be breaking down, all of which gave the recordings an authenticity and emotional honesty that more polished productions would have lacked. Berlin's underground club scene provided the necessary balance. Bowie didn't present his Berlin period as tragic artist mythology. He presented it as survival work, as the unglamorous daily effort of trying to stay alive and sane when your brain chemistry and life circumstances conspire to make both difficult. The albums don't resolve neatly or offer easy comfort. They document a process that was ongoing, uncertain, and often painful. And in doing so, they created a template for how popular art could engage with mental health and recovery in ways that were neither exploitative nor dismissive, that took these struggles seriously as both human experiences and as legitimate subjects for artistic exploration. What often gets lost in discussions of the Berlin Trilogy's artistic achievement is the personal toll this period took on everyone involved. Bowie's depression during these years was severe and persistent, not the temporary low that comes with withdrawal, but a fundamental alteration in his ability to experience pleasure and connection. The coldness in the music wasn't just aesthetic choice. It was accurate representation of what his emotional life felt like after cocaine had burned through his neurochemistry. Recovery meant learning to live with this new baseline, accepting that he might never feel the way he had felt before drugs, that sobriety didn't automatically restore what addiction had taken away. This realization was devastating in its own way, creating a different kind of crisis than the active addiction, but one that was perhaps more existentially difficult because there was no external enemy to fight, no clear path to improvement. For Iggy Pop, the Berlin period was similarly complex. On one hand, it saved his life. Without Bowie's support and the structured environment they created together, he might not have survived his heroin addiction. On the other hand, the experience left him with lasting psychological scars and a complicated relationship with Bowie that mixed gratitude with resentment. Being saved by someone creates a debt that can never really be repaid, and the power imbalance in their friendship during this period affected both men in ways that would take years to process. And for all the other people involved, Tony Visconti watching his friend struggle, Brian Eno navigating the emotional volatility of the sessions, the musicians who had to perform in an atmosphere heavy with depression and barely controlled desperation, the trilogy represented a creative achievement that came at significant personal cost. Were the Berlin years suicide diaries or survival manuals? The answer, like most things about this period, is ambiguous and uncomfortable. The albums Bowie created documented thoughts and feelings that in other circumstances might have led to suicide. the sense that life without emotional warmth wasn't worth living, the exhaustion of constant inner struggle, the appeal of just stopping. But the act of documenting these feelings, of transforming them into art, was itself a survival strategy, a way of making the unbearable bearable by giving it form and structure. The trilogy was both things simultaneously, a record of coming close to death and a mechanism for staying alive. And perhaps that's the most honest thing that can be said about depression and recovery. They're not separate states, but overlapping experiences. And survival doesn't mean transcending darkness, but rather learning to function within it, to create meaning and beauty even when everything feels cold and meaningless. David Bowie left Berlin in 1979, returning to a more conventional life and more commercially accessible music. But he never fully left behind what he learned and created during those 3 years. The trilogy remained his artistic high point, the period when he pushed furthest into genuine experimentation and emotional honesty. And the experience of surviving Berlin, of coming through the other side still alive and still creating, gave him perspective and strength that would serve him for the rest of his life. The Suicide Diaries became, in retrospect, proof that he had chosen life after all, that even in his darkest moments, he had continued to make art, to connect with other people, to show up each day to the difficult work of being human. The Berlin Trilogy stands as monument to that choice, to the possibility that you can look directly at depression and isolation and still decide that creation is worth the effort, that beauty can emerge from coldness, and that survival is its own kind of heroism,